Sometimes the things we're ready to give up on turn out to save us. Sometimes what looks like our biggest problem becomes our greatest blessing. In the dusty hills of Texas, 1879, rancher Colton Briggs had reached his breaking point with Daisy, his stubborn hog, who spent her days tearing up his yard. With his farm failing and debts mounting, he couldn't afford to keep feeding an animal that seemed determined to destroy what little he had left. But as he raised his axe for the final blow, Daisy's relentless digging revealed something that would change everything: a buried chest filled with $10 million in stolen Union gold. What started as the end of his troubles quickly became the beginning of something far more dangerous. Word travels fast in small towns, and soon bounty hunters, outlaws, and corrupt lawmen descended on his property like vultures. But could an aging rancher and his pig really outsmart the deadliest men in the West? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Colton Briggs' front porch, where he sat with a cup of coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. At 53, his hands bore the permanent stains of honest work calluses from rope and leather, scars from barbed wire, and the deep tan that came from decades under the Texas sun. The coffee mug, chipped along one edge, had been Sarah's favorite. Like so many things around the homestead, it carried the weight of memory. His property stretched modest but proud across 30 acres of hill country limestone and scrub oak. The house itself was nothing fancy: 2 rooms and a kitchen that Sarah had somehow made feel like a palace with her touch. Cedar shingles weathered grey by the elements, windows that caught the morning light just right, and a stone chimney that drew smoke clean and true. The barn leaned slightly to the east now, a casualty of the tornado that had blown through 3 springs back, but it still kept the horses dry and the hay protected. From where he sat, Colton could see the entire scope of his domain. The vegetable garden Sarah had planted, now maintained by his own rough hands with considerably less success. The chicken coop, where a dozen Rhode Island Reds scratched and pecked their way through another day. The well that his grandfather had dug, still providing sweet water despite the drought that had plagued the region for months. And there, in the side yard that had once been Sarah's pride, the torn and rutted earth that marked Daisy's daily excavations. The hog in question stood 3 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed close to 400 pounds of pure stubbornness. Her bristled hide showed patches of rust red and black, and her small, intelligent eyes seemed to hold a gleam of mischief that Colton had learned to distrust. Sarah had raised Daisy from a piglet, bottle-feeding her when her mother had died, talking to her like she was a person. "That pig understands every word I say," Sarah used to claim, and Colton had never been entirely sure she was wrong. But Sarah had been gone for 2 years now, taken by a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could touch. The photograph on the mantelpiece, a formal daguerreotype taken on their wedding day, captured her serious expression and kind eyes, but it couldn't hold her laughter or the way she hummed while kneading bread. Without Sarah's gentle influence, Daisy had transformed from a beloved pet into a 400-pound problem, with an appetite that seemed to grow larger every day. The latest evidence of her destructive enthusiasm spread across what had once been a neat yard. Holes dotted the landscape like craters from some miniature war, each one representing another of Daisy's archaeological expeditions. She dug with the focused determination of a prospector, her powerful snout and strong hooves churning up roots, rocks, and carefully maintained flower beds with equal enthusiasm. The roses Sarah had planted were gone. The herb garden was a memory. Even the grass struggled to grow in the constantly disturbed soil. Colton's nearest neighbor, Henry Kowalski, ran cattle on the land to the north. A practical man with 8 children and a wife who could stretch a dollar until it screamed. Henry had offered to buy Daisy more than once. "Make good bacon," he'd say, with his slight Polish accent, and ham for the winter. The offers were always made kindly, understanding the difficult position Colton found himself in, but they stung nonetheless. Selling Sarah's pig would feel like selling a piece of her memory. The financial reality, however, was becoming impossible to ignore. The drought had withered his corn crop to brown stalks that rattled in the wind like old bones. The cotton had barely sprouted before the sun baked it into the ground. His small herd of cattle spent their days looking for shade and water, growing thinner despite his efforts to supplement their diet with expensive hay from suppliers 2 counties over. The banknote on the property came due in 6 months, and Colton's savings had dwindled to a handful of silver dollars and some crumpled bills hidden in a tobacco tin beneath his bed. Every pound of grain that went to feed Daisy represented money he didn't have, and food that could go toward keeping his livestock alive. Every hole she dug seemed to mock his efforts to maintain some dignity in the face of mounting troubles. Yet every time he considered Henry's offer, he found himself remembering Sarah's gentle hands stroking Daisy's bristled hide, her voice soft and affectionate as she told the pig about her day. The general store in town had started extending him credit out of respect for his reputation, but Colton could see the pity in the shopkeeper's eyes. Old Pete Morrison, who served as both doctor and unofficial banker for folks in the area, had mentioned that there might be work available with the railroad survey team heading through next spring. Steady wages, he'd said, though it would mean leaving the homestead for months at a time. The thought of abandoning the land, even temporarily, felt like another small death. This ground held the graves of his parents, the foundation stones his grandfather had laid, the memories of every good year and bad that had shaped his life. Sarah was buried beneath the old oak tree on the south ridge, and leaving would mean leaving her. But as Colton sat on his porch, watching Daisy root enthusiastically through what had once been Sarah's prized flower bed, practical necessity began to outweigh sentimental attachment. He couldn't afford to feed a 400-pound pet when he could barely feed himself. The pig would bring enough money to buy seed for next year's planting, to pay down some of his debt, to buy him time to figure out a more permanent solution. The decision, when it finally crystallized in his mind, came with a weight that settled in his chest like a stone. He would give Daisy 1 more week to prove her worth, to find some way to justify the grain she consumed and the destruction she caused. If she continued her campaign of excavation and expense, he would take Henry up on his offer. It seemed the kindest solution. Henry had a large family to feed and would see that nothing went to waste. Colton finished his cold coffee and set the mug on the porch rail, where it would catch the afternoon sun and remind him of Sarah's smile. The day stretched ahead, with its familiar routines of feeding, watering, and maintaining what he could of his small corner of the world. But underneath it all ran the current of a decision made, a line drawn in the dust of his failing fortunes. He walked toward the barn to begin his morning chores, stepping carefully around the fresh holes that marked Daisy's latest night work. The pig herself was nowhere to be seen, probably sleeping off her excavations in the shade of the barn. In 1 week, he told himself, this daily navigation of disturbed earth would be nothing but a memory. What he couldn't know, as he hauled water to the horse trough and scattered grain for the chickens, was that Daisy's seemingly destructive digging was following a pattern older than his homestead, older than his family's claim to this piece of Texas. 15 feet below the surface, in a hand-dug cache that had waited nearly 2 decades to be discovered, lay the answer to problems he didn't even know he had, and the beginning of troubles that would test every skill he'd learned in 5 decades of frontier life. The week passed, with the relentless predictability of a clock winding down. Each morning brought fresh evidence of Daisy's nocturnal activities, and each evening found Colton filling water buckets and calculating the cost of grain against his dwindling resources. By Thursday, his patience had worn thin as paper, and by Saturday it had disappeared entirely. He rose before dawn on the appointed day, the 7th day of his self-imposed deadline, and walked to the barn to collect his father's splitting axe. The handle, worn smooth by decades of use, felt familiar in his hands. He'd used this same axe to split the logs for Sarah's coffin, a task he'd insisted on doing himself, despite offers of help from neighbors. Today it would serve a different kind of ending, but an ending nonetheless. Daisy had spent the night creating her most ambitious excavation yet, a crater near the old oak tree that was easily 4 feet across and deep enough that Colton couldn't see the bottom from ground level. Dirt was scattered in all directions, and several of the tree's exposed roots bore the marks of her powerful hooves and determined snout. It was as if she'd decided to make her case for execution as compelling as possible. "Enough," Colton said aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "This has gone on long enough." He found her sleeping in the barn, sprawled across a pile of hay that had cost him $2 he couldn't spare. Her contentment struck him as almost insulting. Here was an animal living better than many people he knew, fed and sheltered and protected, repaying that kindness by systematically destroying everything around her. The moral mathematics of the situation seemed clear enough. The axe handle felt heavier as he walked back toward the oak tree, Daisy following with the trusting enthusiasm she'd always shown. Sarah had trained her to come when called, to follow simple commands, to behave more like a loyal dog than a barnyard animal. That training would make what came next both easier and more difficult. "Stay," Colton commanded when they reached the edge of her latest crater. Daisy settled onto her haunches with a satisfied grunt, apparently pleased to be near her handiwork. The morning sun, climbing steadily toward a cloudless sky, cast their shadows long and dark across the disturbed earth. Colton raised the axe, feeling the weight of necessity and regret pulling at his shoulders. One clean stroke would be all it took. Daisy would feel no pain, would have no time for fear or confusion. It was more merciful than the slaughterhouse, more personal than selling her to Henry. At least this way, he could ensure it was done right. But as he drew back for the strike, Daisy's attention shifted away from him to something at the bottom of her excavation. She made a low, interested noise, not quite a grunt, not quite a whine, and began to nose at the edge of the pit. Her tail, such as it was, gave a little wag of excitement. "What the devil?" Colton began, then stopped. At the bottom of the hole, partially exposed where Daisy's digging had scraped away layers of soil and limestone, something metallic caught the morning light. He lowered the axe and crouched at the edge of the pit, squinting into the shadows. The object was rectangular, dark with age and corrosion, but unmistakably man-made. Iron bands wrapped around what appeared to be a wooden chest, the metal eaten with rust, but still holding its shape. It was wedged tight in the limestone, which explained why Daisy's efforts had been necessary to expose it. "I'll be damned," Colton muttered, setting the axe aside and sliding down into the hole. The chest was smaller than it had appeared from above, perhaps 2 feet long and half as wide, but it was substantial, heavy enough that it took considerable effort to work it free from the rock that had held it for God knew how long. With Daisy watching from above, her small eyes bright with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction, Colton wrestled the chest up and out of the pit. The iron bands held, though the wood beneath them showed signs of age and moisture damage. There was no visible lock, just a simple latch that had rusted into a solid mass. He carried his find to the porch, where better light and his tools would let him examine it properly. Daisy followed, making small sounds of contentment that suggested she understood exactly what had just happened. The pig had found something valuable, something that might change everything at the precise moment when her execution had been imminent. The latch yielded to patient work with a small crowbar, scraping and flaking as the rust gave way. When it finally opened with a protesting screech of metal, Colton had to blink several times to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. The chest was lined with oiled leather that had kept its contents remarkably well preserved, and those contents made his breath catch in his throat. Gold coins filled the chest, nearly to the brim, hundreds of them, each one catching the morning light like a tiny sun. They were larger than any coins he'd seen before, heavy in his palm when he picked one up for closer examination. The face showed an eagle with spread wings, and the words "United States of America" circled the edge. The reverse bore the profile of a woman crowned with stars, with $20 and the date 1863 clearly visible. $20 gold pieces. Double eagles. Colton had heard of such things but had never seen one, let alone held one. And here was a chest full of them, more wealth than he'd ever imagined existing in one place. He counted quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted layer after layer of gleaming metal. 200 coins, maybe more. $4,000, maybe $5,000. Enough to pay off his debts, buy new livestock, repair his buildings, and still have money left over for years of comfortable living. Enough to transform his failing homestead into a prosperous ranch. Enough to build the life he and Sarah had dreamed of but never quite achieved. But as the initial shock of discovery faded, questions began to crowd his mind. Why were these coins buried on his property? How long had they been there? And most importantly, who did they rightfully belong to? The dates on the coins were all from the early 1860s, the heart of the war between the states. Gold of this quantity didn't just appear in remote Texas counties by accident. It had been put here deliberately, hidden by someone who'd intended to return for it. The fact that it had remained undisturbed for so many years suggested that whoever had buried it had never been able to come back. Colton sat on his porch steps, the open chest between his knees, and tried to think clearly, despite the magnitude of what lay before him. His first instinct was honest, to report the find to the authorities, to see if there were records of missing gold from the war years. But his second instinct, born of desperation and practical need, whispered that possession was 9/10 of the law, that this gold had been found on his property through his pig's efforts. The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came the sounds of his neighbors beginning their daily routines. Smoke rose from Henry's chimney, a rooster crowed from the direction of town. Normal life continued around him while he sat transfixed by a fortune that had literally been unearthed at his feet. Daisy settled beside him with a contented sigh, resting her massive head against his leg. The pig that had been minutes away from slaughter had instead delivered salvation. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor was the debt he now owed to an animal he'd been ready to kill. "Well, girl," he said quietly, scratching behind her ears the way Sarah used to do, "I reckon you've earned yourself a stay of execution. Question is, what do we do now?" The chest sat open before them, its golden contents gleaming in the strengthening sunlight. Beautiful and terrible and full of possibilities that stretched in directions Colton couldn't yet imagine. He only knew that his life had just changed forever, and that the quiet desperation of the past 2 years had been replaced by something far more complex. For the first time since Sarah's death, the future held promise. But as he would soon discover, it also held dangers he could never have anticipated. Colton spent the better part of Sunday exploring the chest more thoroughly, and what he found made his pulse quicken with both excitement and unease. Wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the top layer of coins was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, but still legible in the careful script of someone who'd learned his letters well. The journal belonged to someone named Marcus Whitmore, and its first entry was dated April 15th, 1865, the very day President Lincoln was shot. The handwriting was steady and precise, suggesting education and breeding, but the content revealed a man whose world had come crashing down around his ears. "The war is over," the first entry began, "and with it, everything I fought for these 4 years. Lee surrendered at Appomattox 6 days ago, though word didn't reach our position until yesterday. Colonel Brennan has discharged what remains of the 4th Texas Cavalry, and we are to make our own way home as best we can. Colton read by lamplight as the evening stretched long, Daisy sleeping peacefully at his feet like some oversized dog. The journal painted a picture of a Confederate officer facing the collapse of everything he'd believed in, a man of property and position, watching his entire world transform into something he no longer recognized. But Marcus Whitmore had not gone gentle into that uncertain future. The entries that followed detailed a plan born of desperation and justified by necessity. A Union payroll train was traveling west through Texas, carrying gold to pay the occupying forces that would reshape the defeated Confederacy. Whitmore had gathered a small band of men, former soldiers like himself, who faced futures of poverty and federal reconstruction, and they intended to liberate that gold for their own purposes. "We are not common thieves," Whitmore had written with obvious care to justify his actions. "We take only what the federal government has stolen from our homeland, gold that will be used to oppress our people and destroy our way of life. Better it should serve those who truly understand its value." The robbery had apparently gone off without serious difficulty. Whitmore's accounts described the careful planning, the execution near a water stop outside Austin, and the successful escape with nearly $5,000 in gold coins. But what should have been a simple matter of dividing the spoils and disappearing into the chaos of post-war Texas had instead become something far more complicated. Brennan shows his true nature now. Read an entry dated 3 weeks later. He speaks of taking the gold to Mexico, of establishing ourselves as gentlemen of leisure while our countrymen starve. Morrison agrees with him, the fool, dazzled by visions of cantinas and dark-eyed women. They do not understand that this gold represents something more than personal comfort. It is our responsibility to use it wisely, to rebuild rather than abandon. The division among the conspirators had deepened over the following weeks. Whitmore's journal chronicled arguments and growing suspicion, plans made and discarded, and the gradual realization that his partners could not be trusted with their shared secret. The gold, which should have been their salvation, was becoming a source of deadly conflict. The final entry, dated nearly 2 months after the robbery, was written in a shakier hand that suggested either illness or fear. "I have hidden the gold where they will never find it, in ground that holds meaning for me beyond its practical value. My grandmother's people lived on this land before the white man came, and she told me stories of caves and hidden places that few eyes have seen. The gold waits in such a place now, and I pray that if I do not survive to reclaim it, someone more worthy than Brennan or Morrison will find it in God's own time." The location was described in terms that made Colton's blood run cold with recognition. The old oak tree, the limestone outcropping to the south, the view of 3 hills that formed a natural arrow pointing east, all of it matched his property with devastating accuracy. Marcus Whitmore had buried stolen Union gold on land that would eventually become the Briggs homestead, and he died before he could return for it. But the journal's final pages held an even more disturbing revelation. Whitmore suspected that his former partners had discovered his hiding place, that they were closing in on him even as he made his final entries. His fear bled through the careful handwriting, and his last words carried the weight of a man who knew his time was running out. If Brennan finds this journal, he will have all he needs to claim what he believes is his, but the gold was never his, just as it was never truly mine. It belongs to the future, to someone who will use it better than we could. I pray that person proves more worthy than 3 Confederate thieves who let greed destroy their honor. Colton closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness, his mind churning with implications. The gold in his chest had been stolen from a Union payroll train by desperate Confederate soldiers. One of those soldiers had hidden it on his land and died before he could retrieve it. The other conspirators, Brennan and Morrison, had presumably never found it, or they would have dug it up years ago. But that raised disturbing questions about what had become of those men. Were they still alive, still searching? Had they passed their knowledge on to sons or partners who might still consider the gold rightfully theirs? The name Morrison stuck in his memory like a thorn. Old Pete Morrison, who served as doctor and unofficial banker for the community, was about the right age to have fought in the war. Could he be the same Morrison mentioned in Whitmore's journal? It seemed too great a coincidence, but then again, this part of Texas hadn't seen a great deal of settlement since the war ended. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the evening quiet. Colton quickly closed the chest and carried it inside, placing it beneath his bed where the shadows would hide its outline. He grabbed his rifle from its place above the fireplace and stepped onto the porch, trying to appear casual despite the tension that suddenly gripped his shoulders. 3 riders approached in the moonlight, their faces obscured by hat brims and distance. They rode with the easy confidence of men accustomed to being welcomed wherever they went, but something about their posture suggested readiness for trouble. As they drew closer, Colton recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Hawkins from town, a soft man who'd grown fat on bribes and selective enforcement of territorial law. "Evening, Briggs," Hawkins called as they reined up in front of the porch. "Hope you don't mind us calling so late. We've had some reports of unusual activity out this way. Thought we'd check in on you." "What kind of activity?" Colton asked, keeping his voice level, despite the ice that had formed in his stomach. The rifle in his hands suddenly felt both reassuring and inadequate. "Oh, strangers asking questions in town, men who seem mighty interested in your property, your family history. Thought you ought to know, in case they come calling." Hawkins' tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp in the moonlight. "You haven't noticed anyone snooping around, have you? Anyone who might be looking for something specific?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Colton understood that he was being tested, that his answer would determine how this conversation proceeded. Behind Hawkins, the other 2 riders sat silent and watchful, their hands resting conspicuously near their weapon belts. "Can't say I have," Colton replied carefully. "Property's been quiet since the drought started. Most folks are too busy trying to keep their own places running to worry about mine." "That's good to hear," Hawkins said, but he made no move to leave. "Funny thing about these strangers, though, they seem to know quite a bit about the history of your land. Things that happened during the war, before your family settled here. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The implications were clear enough. Someone knew about the gold, knew about its connection to his property, and was asking questions that had reached the sheriff's ears. Whether Hawkins was genuinely concerned for Colton's safety or was working with whoever was making the inquiries remained to be seen, but either way, the secret was already compromised. "Sheriff," Colton said carefully, "if there's something specific you think I should know about, I'd appreciate you sharing it. Otherwise, I've got an early day tomorrow and would like to get some rest." The tension stretched between them for a long moment before Hawkins touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that looked polite but felt like a threat. "Of course, Colton, just doing my job, looking out for the citizens of the county. You have a good evening now." The 3 riders turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Colton alone on his porch with the weight of unwelcome knowledge and the growing certainty that his quiet life was about to become very complicated indeed. The following morning brought visitors of a different sort, though no less troubling for their apparent legitimacy. Colton was tending to his horses when 2 men approached on foot, having apparently left their mounts tied at the property line. They moved with the deliberate caution of men accustomed to dangerous work, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings even as they maintained a facade of casual interest. The older of the 2 was tall and lean, with graying hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the homestead. His companion was younger but carried himself with the same predatory alertness, his right hand never straying far from the pistol at his hip. Both men wore the dusty clothes of traveling professionals, not quite cowboys, not quite lawmen, but something that combined elements of both. "Morning," the older man called as they approached the corral. "Name's Silas Kane. This here's my partner, Dutch Kerner." We're with Pinkerton Detective Agency, investigating some irregularities from the war years. Wonder if we might have a word with you." Colton's blood chilled at the name Pinkerton, though he kept his expression neutral. The detective agency had built its reputation on relentless pursuit of train robbers and other criminals who operated across territorial lines. If they were asking questions about his property, it meant the stolen gold had attracted attention from people with resources and authority. "Irregularities?" Colton asked, setting down his curry brush and giving the men his full attention. "What kind of irregularities?" "Missing government property from 1,865, Kane replied smoothly. "A substantial amount of gold that disappeared from a Union payroll train. We have reason to believe it might be connected to this area, possibly buried somewhere on land that belonged to certain Confederate sympathizers." The detective's gaze was steady and measuring, and Colton had the uncomfortable feeling that every micro-expression on his face was being analyzed and catalogued. These were professionals who made their living reading people, and he was woefully unprepared for such scrutiny. "Can't say I know anything about that," Colton said. "My family didn't settle here until after the war, bought the land from the territorial government in '68. Whatever happened here before that, we weren't part of it." "Of course not," Kane agreed, but his tone suggested he was merely being polite. "Still, you might have found things over the years. Artifacts, perhaps. Old coins, jewelry, anything that seemed out of place for a working ranch." The question was artfully constructed, seemingly innocent, but clearly designed to elicit a specific response. Colton understood that he was walking through a minefield of potential revelations, that even the most casual admission could lead to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. "Nothing worth mentioning," he said. "Arrowheads now and then, old horseshoes. The usual things you find when you're working land that's been settled for a while." Dutch spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested German heritage. "Your pig there," he said, nodding toward Daisy, who was rooting contentedly near the barn. "She's quite the digger. Must turn up all sorts of interesting things." The observation sent a chill down Colton's spine. These men had been watching his property, studying his routines, noting details that seemed insignificant but might prove otherwise. The casual reference to Daisy's digging habits suggested they'd been conducting surveillance for some time. "She's a nuisance," Colton replied, trying to inject the right note of irritation into his voice. "Tears up everything she can get her snout into. I've been thinking about having her butchered just to save my yard." "That would be unfortunate," Kane said mildly. "Pigs can be quite useful animals, especially intelligent ones. They have a remarkable ability to find things that others might miss." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with the detectives asking seemingly innocent questions about the property's history, his knowledge of previous owners, and any unusual discoveries he might have made. Colton answered as honestly as he dared, while revealing nothing of substance, but he could feel the weight of their scrutiny like a physical presence. After they left, promising to return if they had additional questions, Colton retreated to his house and carefully examined the chest hidden beneath his bed. The gold gleamed as brightly as ever, but its beauty now carried undertones of menace. Possession of stolen government property would be a federal crime, possibly carrying a lengthy prison sentence or worse. But as he studied Marcus Whitmore's journal more carefully, a different concern began to emerge. The detectives' questions had been informed by specific knowledge they knew about the robbery, knew about Confederate involvement, and seemed to know about the connection to his property. That suggested they had sources of information beyond what might be found in official records. That afternoon, Colton rode into town with a carefully prepared list of supplies and errands that would give him opportunities to gauge the local mood. His first stop was the general store, where proprietor Samuel Hayes greeted him with the slightly strained friendliness of a man extending credit to someone whose ability to pay was questionable. "Afternoon, Colton," Hayes said, consulting the ledger where Colton's growing debt was carefully documented. "What can I do for you today?" "Need some grain for the livestock," Colton replied, "and maybe some coffee if you can spare it. Been having visitors lately, want to be hospitable." "Visitors?" Hayes' interest was immediately piqued. "Anyone I know?" "Couple of men from the Pinkerton agency, asking questions about the war years. Seemed to think something important might be buried out my way." The effect was immediate and telling. Hayes' expression shifted from casual interest to sharp attention, and his eyes darted briefly toward the back room, where he kept his more valuable merchandise and conducted his private business. "Pinkertons, you say? What kind of questions?" "Oh, the usual. Missing government property, Confederate sympathizers, that sort of thing." Colton kept his tone deliberately casual while watching Hayes' reaction carefully. "Can't say I was much help to them, but they seemed mighty interested in my property." "I imagine they were," Hayes muttered, then caught himself and forced a smile. "Well, I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Those detective types are always chasing shadows from the old days." But Hayes' hands were trembling slightly as he measured out the grain, and when he thought Colton wasn't looking, his gaze kept drifting toward a cracked spyglass that sat on a shelf behind the counter. The instrument was positioned to provide a view of the street through the store's front window, and Colton realized, with growing unease, that it would also command an excellent view of anyone approaching the building. His next stop was the barber shop, where old Pete Morrison was holding court with several other men from the community. The conversation ceased abruptly when Colton entered, and the silence that followed carried weight that had nothing to do with normal social awkwardness. "Afternoon, Pete," Colton said, settling into the barber's chair despite having no real need for a haircut. "Been a while since we talked." "Indeed it has," Morrison replied, but his usual warmth was notably absent. His hands, normally steady despite his 70-odd years, showed a slight tremor as he prepared his implements. "Here you've been having visitors out your way. Word travels fast in a small town," Colton observed, "though I'm surprised it's news worth spreading." "Oh, when Pinkerton detectives start asking questions, people tend to take notice," said Bill Crawford, who ran the livery stable, "especially when those questions concern missing gold from the war years." The comment hung in the air like an accusation, and Colton realized that whatever secrets his property held were already common knowledge among at least some members of the community. The question was whether that knowledge came from historical research or more direct sources. "Pete," Colton said carefully, "you've been here longer than most. You ever hear stories about Confederate soldiers hiding treasure around these parts?" Morrison's hand froze for just a moment before resuming its work, but that hesitation was enough to confirm Colton's growing suspicions. The old doctor knew something, and his knowledge made him uncomfortable. "Stories, yes," Morrison said carefully. "Lots of stories from those days. Men did desperate things when their world was ending, but stories and facts are different creatures entirely." "True enough," Colton agreed. "Still, makes a man curious, especially when strangers start showing up with official badges and pointed questions." The conversation that followed was a careful dance of implications and evasions, with each man probing for information while revealing as little as possible. But by the time Colton left the barber shop, he was certain that Pete Morrison knew more about the buried gold than he was willing to admit. Whether that knowledge made him an ally or an enemy remained to be seen. The ride home was conducted under the weight of growing paranoia. Every distant rider might be a scout for the Pinkerton detectives. Every shadow could conceal someone watching his movements. The peaceful isolation that had once comforted him now felt like vulnerability, leaving him exposed to threats he couldn't see coming. Back at the homestead, Daisy greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, apparently oblivious to the danger her archaeological efforts had unleashed. As he watched her root through the dirt near the barn, Colton realized that his biggest problem wasn't just the gold itself, it was the fact that too many people already knew about it, or suspected its existence strongly enough to bring federal attention to his property. The chest hidden beneath his bed represented more than just financial salvation now. It was evidence of a federal crime, bait for dangerous men, and the catalyst for conflicts he was ill-equipped to handle. but it was also his only chance of escaping the crushing debt and failed dreams that had defined his life since Sarah's death. As evening approached and the shadows lengthened across his property, Colton made a decision that would have surprised his younger self. He would not give up the gold without a fight. Whatever dangers it brought, whatever enemies it attracted, he would find a way to keep what Daisy had discovered. The alternative, returning to the slow slide toward poverty and despair, was no longer acceptable. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was up against, and that meant learning more about the men who were asking questions about his land. The cracked spyglass in Hayes's store suggested that surveillance was already underway, and if he was being watched, he needed to know by whom and for what purpose. The game was just beginning, and Colton Briggs was about to discover that a quiet rancher could become a dangerous man when his back was against the wall and his survival was at stake. The silver pocket watch in Sheriff Hawkins' vest caught the morning sunlight as he consulted it for the third time in 10 minutes, his growing impatience evident in the tight set of his jaw. He stood in the shadow of the general store's awning, ostensibly examining a wanted poster, but actually maintaining a clear view of the road that led to the Briggs homestead. The watch had been his father's, a railroad man's timepiece that kept perfect time and reminded him daily of the opportunities that careful planning and patient waiting could bring. "He should have been here by now," muttered Kane, the Pinkerton detective who had taken up residence in the store's back room 3 days earlier. "Briggs usually comes to town twice a week, regular as clockwork." "Maybe he's getting careful," Hawkins replied, snapping the watch closed and tucking it back into his vest. "Man finds a fortune in stolen gold, he might start changing his habits." The admission that they both knew about Colton's discovery hung between them like a shared secret. Hawkins had been working with the Pinkertons for months, ever since Kane had approached him with information about the missing union payroll and the substantial reward that would come with its recovery. The sheriff's position gave him access to property records, tax documents, and local gossip that would take outsiders months to compile, making him an invaluable asset in their investigation. But what had started as a straightforward case of historical detective work had become complicated by the realization that the gold was no longer simply hidden, it had been found. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Briggs' sudden absence from his usual routines, the way he'd deflected their questions, and most telling of all, the fresh excavation near the old oak tree that Dutch had spotted during their surveillance. "We could just take him," Dutch suggested from his position by the window. "Bring him in for questioning. Search the property while he's in custody." "On what grounds?" Kane shook his head. "We have suspicions, not evidence. And if we're wrong, if he really doesn't have the gold, we've tipped our hand and gained nothing. Better to maintain pressure, make him nervous enough to make a mistake." Hawkins nodded agreement, though his reasons were more complex than Kane realized. The sheriff had his own plans for the gold, plans that didn't necessarily include sharing the recovery reward with his temporary partners. If he could maneuver events correctly, he might find himself in possession of both the gold and the official credit for solving a 15-year-old federal case. "Besides," Hawkins added, "Briggs isn't going anywhere. Man's lived on that land for over a decade, buried his wife there. He's not the type to run, especially not with a 400-pound pig to worry about." The mention of Daisy brought a rare smile to Kane's weathered face. The pig had become something of a legend in their surveillance reports, an unlikely catalyst whose digging had apparently succeeded where professional treasure hunters had failed. There was a certain poetic justice to the idea that a Union payroll stolen by Confederate soldiers had been recovered by a pig with no understanding of politics or history. "What about Morrison?" Dutch asked. "He's been acting strange since we started asking questions. Keeps looking over his shoulder like he expects trouble." "Old Pete's got reasons to be nervous," Hawkins replied. "He was here during the war, served with the Confederate Medical Corps, probably worried we'll start digging into his past, asking uncomfortable questions about his service record." But even as he spoke, Hawkins wondered if there might be more to Morrison's anxiety than wartime memories. The old doctor had been one of the first settlers in the area after the war, had purchased his property with gold coins that he'd claimed were savings from his medical practice. It was possible, even likely, that Morrison knew more about the buried treasure than he'd admitted. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his speculation. Colton Briggs rode into town with the measured pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, though his eyes swept the street with newfound alertness. He dismounted at the general store and tied his horse with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the action thousands of times. But there was a tension in his movements that hadn't been there a week ago. "Showtime," Kane murmured, settling back into the shadows, where he could observe without being seen. Hawkins waited until Colton had entered the store before making his own move, timing his arrival to seem coincidental. He found the rancher examining a selection of ammunition with more interest than his usual purchases would warrant. "Afternoon, Colton," Hawkins said with false heartiness. "Stocking up for hunting season?" "Just replacing what I've used," Colton replied without looking up from the cartridge boxes. "Coyotes have been troubling my livestock lately. Man needs to be prepared for varmints." The exchange of pleasantries continued for several minutes, each man probing carefully for information while revealing nothing of substance. But Hawkins noticed that Colton's selections included rifle cartridges for long-range work and shotgun shells loaded with buckshot ammunition better suited for defending against men than predators. The rancher was clearly expecting trouble, which suggested he had something worth protecting. When Colton left the store, he was followed at a discreet distance by Dutch, who had developed considerable skill at trailing suspects without detection. The Pinkertons' report that evening confirmed what Hawkins had suspected. Briggs was taking precautions, varying his route home, stopping frequently to study his back trail and maintaining the alertness of a man who knew he was being hunted. "He's got the gold," Kane declared over dinner in the hotel's private dining room. "Everything about his behavior screams guilty knowledge. The question is whether we try to take him now or wait for him to lead us to it." "We wait," Hawkins said firmly. "Rushed moves lead to mistakes, and we can't afford mistakes with this much money at stake. Besides, he's not going anywhere. We've got him boxed in, and he knows it." But even as he spoke, Hawkins was planning his own moves in the complex game that was developing. The gold represented more than just a recovery reward. It was a chance to escape the limitations of small-town law enforcement, to establish himself as a man of substance and influence. The key was timing his betrayal of the Pinkertons correctly, ensuring that he controlled the situation when the final cards were played. 3 days later, the chess match took on a new dimension when a messenger arrived from Austin with orders that made Hawkins' hands tremble as he read them. The territorial governor had received reports of Pinkerton activity in the area and was sending a federal marshal to investigate both the missing gold and the methods being used to recover it. Marshal Tom Bradley was due to arrive within the week, and his reputation for honest dealing made him a serious threat to the carefully constructed conspiracy that Hawkins and Kane had built. "This changes everything," Kane said when he received the news. "Bradley's not someone we can buy or intimidate. If he starts asking the right questions, he'll uncover our arrangement, and we'll all end up in federal prison. Then we move now," Hawkins replied, his decision crystallizing under pressure. "We take Briggs tonight, recover the gold, and present the whole thing as a solved case when Bradley arrives. Fait accompli." It was a desperate plan, fraught with risks and dependent on assumptions they couldn't verify. But with a federal marshal en route and their window of opportunity closing rapidly, desperate measures seemed like the only option. The silver pocket watch in Hawkins' vest ticked away the seconds until nightfall, when they would finally discover whether Colton Briggs was the key to their fortune or the architect of their destruction. As darkness settled over the town and the three conspirators made their final preparations, none of them suspected that their careful surveillance had been noted and analyzed by the very man they were hunting. Colton Briggs might be a simple rancher, but he was also a survivor who had learned to read danger in the subtle signs that others missed. The game was about to enter its final phase, and all the players were about to discover that they had seriously underestimated their opposition. The hand-carved wooden cross that had belonged to Sarah sat on the mantelpiece where it had remained untouched for 2 years, its simple lines worn smooth by her fingers during countless evening prayers. Colton had avoided looking at it since her death, unable to bear the reminder of faith that had seemed to abandon them when they needed it most. But tonight, with danger closing in from all sides and his soul heavy with the weight of stolen gold, he found himself drawn to its quiet presence. Sarah had carved the cross herself during their second winter together, when money was scarce and store-bought decorations were beyond their reach. She'd used cedar from their own land, cutting and shaping the wood with the patient skill that had marked everything she touched. God doesn't need fancy churches or golden crosses, she'd told him as she worked. He just needs a sincere heart and the willingness to do what's right, even when it's hard. The irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. Here he sat, surrounded by enough stolen gold to live comfortably for the rest of his life, wrestling with moral questions that Sarah would have answered without hesitation. She would have insisted on returning the money, regardless of the personal cost, because keeping stolen property was wrong, no matter how desperate their circumstances. Her certainty in such matters had always been both inspiring and infuriating, a moral compass that pointed unerringly toward principles that sometimes seemed at odds with practical survival. But Sarah was gone, and the decisions that faced him now were his alone to make. The gold represented not just financial security, but the difference between keeping the land she'd loved and losing everything they'd built together. Her grave lay beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where Daisy had uncovered the treasure that might save or destroy him. Leaving would mean abandoning both Sarah's final resting place and the dreams they'd shared. The sound of Daisy's contented grunting from the front porch broke his reverie. The pig had taken to sleeping near the house, as if sensing the tension that had settled over the homestead like a storm cloud. Her presence was both comfort and reminder. Without her stubborn excavations, the gold would still be buried, and his life would still be sliding toward quiet desperation. But her discovery had also attracted dangerous attention, transforming his peaceful isolation into a battlefield where the stakes were measured in gold and blood. Colton rose from his chair and walked to the window, peering out at the darkness that surrounded his property. Somewhere in that darkness, he was certain, eyes were watching his every move. The Pinkerton detectives had been careful, but not careful enough to hide their surveillance from a man who'd spent his life reading the subtle signs of the natural world. The way birds avoided certain areas, the tracks that appeared where no livestock should have been, the glint of sunlight on metal where none should exist, all of it pointed to watchers who thought themselves hidden. The situation had deteriorated rapidly over the past week. His credit at the general store had been mysteriously revoked, forcing him to pay cash for supplies he could barely afford. Neighbors, who had been friendly for years now, regarded him with suspicion and barely concealed fear. Even Henry Kowalski, who had offered to buy Daisy just days earlier, now avoided him entirely. Word of the Pinkerton investigation had spread through the community like wildfire, and public opinion had already convicted him of crimes he hadn't committed. But the most troubling development had been his conversation with Pete Morrison the previous afternoon. The old doctor had appeared at his door just after sunset, nervous and agitated in a way that immediately set Colton on edge. Morrison's story, told in whispered fragments while his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, had filled in crucial details about the buried gold and the men who were hunting it. "I knew Marcus Whitmore," Morrison had confessed, his weathered hands shaking as he spoke. "Served under him in the medical corps, patched up his wounds after Shiloh. He was a good man, Colton, but the war changed him like it changed all of us, made him do things he never would have considered in peacetime." The old doctor's knowledge of the robbery had been intimate and detailed, confirming what Colton had read in Whitmore's journal while adding crucial context. Morrison had been the fourth member of the conspiracy, the one who'd stayed behind to treat Confederate wounded while his partners executed their desperate plan. He'd never received his share of the gold, but he'd also never been hunted by the law or fellow conspirators. Brennan died in Mexico in '67, Morrison had continued, knifed in a cantina fight over a poker game. But before he died, he talked. Sold information about the gold to anyone who'd buy it, including some federal agents who've been following cold leads ever since. That's how the Pinkertons knew to come here. They bought Brennan's deathbed confession. The revelation had explained much about the current situation, but it had also raised new fears. If Brennan had sold the information once, copies might exist in other hands. The federal government's interest was bad enough, but corrupt lawmen and private treasure hunters represented different kinds of danger entirely. You need to get rid of that gold, Morrison had urged. Bury it somewhere else, throw it in a river, anything. As long as it's on your property, you're a target for every greedy bastard who's heard the story. But Colton had already considered and rejected that option. The gold was too heavy to move secretly, and any attempt to relocate it would require explanations he couldn't give. Moreover, abandoning the treasure now would mean accepting the slow death of his dreams, watching his property slip away, piece by piece, until nothing remained of the life he'd built with Sarah. Instead, he'd made a different decision, one that would have horrified his peace-loving wife, but seemed inevitable, given his circumstances. If dangerous men were coming for his gold, he would be ready for them. The homestead that had been his sanctuary would become his fortress, and he would defend it with whatever means necessary. The preparations had taken 3 days of careful work. Windows were reinforced with shutters that could stop rifle bullets. The well was stocked with extra water and basic medical supplies. Food was cached in locations that would remain accessible even if the house came under siege. Most importantly, he'd prepared defensive positions that would allow him to fight from cover while exposing attackers to deadly crossfire. Sarah's cross caught the lamplight as he turned from the window, its simple beauty, a stark contrast to the weapons he'd cleaned and loaded earlier that evening. She would have been ashamed of his choices, would have insisted that violence was never the answer to human conflict. But she would also have understood his refusal to abandon the land where she rested, the dreams they'd shared, and the future they'd planned together. "I'm sorry, love," he whispered to her memory. "I know this isn't what you would have wanted, but I can't let them take what's ours. Can't let your sacrifice mean nothing." Outside, Daisy stirred restlessly, her acute senses detecting something that hadn't yet registered on human awareness. Colton extinguished the lamp and moved to his prepared position near the front window, rifle in hand and heart heavy with the knowledge that the peaceful life he'd known was about to end forever. The wooden cross remained on the mantelpiece, silent witness to prayers that had gone unanswered and faith that had been tested beyond endurance. But perhaps, Colton thought, as he settled in to wait for whatever the darkness might bring, Sarah's influence would prove stronger than death, her moral compass still pointing the way, even when the path led through violence toward an uncertain redemption. The brass Confederate button lay hidden beneath layers of sediment and time, its surface green with verdigris, but still bearing the distinctive pattern of crossed cannons that marked it as artillery corps insignia. Colton discovered it while carefully examining the area where Daisy had found the gold chest, searching for any additional clues about the treasure's origins. What he found instead changed everything he thought he knew about Marcus Whitmore's journal and the true nature of the buried fortune. The button was embedded in the limestone at the bottom of Daisy's excavation, positioned in a way that suggested it had been dropped or torn loose during the original burial. But as Colton cleaned away the accumulated dirt and corrosion, he realized that the markings didn't match what he'd expected to find. According to Whitmore's journal, the gold had been stolen from a Union payroll train by Confederate cavalry soldiers. This button, however, bore the insignia of the 3rd Texas Artillery, a unit that had been stationed in East Texas throughout the final year of the war. More disturbing still was the date stamped into the metal, 1864. If Whitmore's account was accurate, the robbery had taken place in April of 1865, nearly a year after this button was manufactured. The discrepancy might have been meaningless. Soldiers often wore older equipment, but combined with other inconsistencies, Colton had begun to notice it suggested that the journal's version of events was incomplete or deliberately misleading. His growing suspicions were confirmed that evening when Pete Morrison arrived at his door unannounced, carrying a leather satchel and wearing an expression of grim determination that Colton had never seen before. The old doctor moved with surprising agility for his age, scanning the darkness before stepping inside and barring the door behind him. "We need to talk," Morrison said without preamble, "and we don't have much time. Hawkins and those Pinkerton men are planning something for tonight. I heard them talking in the hotel dining room." "What kind of something?" Colton asked, though the tension in Morrison's voice already provided most of the answer. "The kind that ends with you dead and the gold in their pockets," Morrison replied bluntly. "They know you found it, and they're not planning to let legal niceties get in their way." The old doctor set his satchel on the kitchen table and began removing items with practiced efficiency. Bandages, surgical instruments, bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid. It was the field kit of a man who'd spent years treating bullet wounds and preparing for violence, and its appearance in Colton's kitchen confirmed that the situation had moved far beyond threats and surveillance. "Pete," Colton said carefully, "I found something today that doesn't match up with what you told me about Whitmore and the robbery. This button, it's from the 3rd Texas Artillery, and it was made in 1864. Morrison's hands stilled for a moment before he looked up with eyes that held decades of carefully guarded secrets. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession and the relief of finally sharing a burden that had grown too heavy to carry alone. "Marcus Whitmore never robbed a Union payroll train," Morrison said quietly. "That was the story we agreed on, the lie we told ourselves to make what we did seem like something other than plain theft." The truth, revealed in halting segments as Morrison arranged his medical supplies, was far more complex and morally ambiguous than the journal had suggested. The gold had indeed been stolen during the final weeks of the Confederacy, but its origins were much closer to home than Austin or any Union stronghold. There was a Confederate paymaster traveling through East Texas in March of 1865, Morrison continued. Major William Brennan, carrying gold intended for troops that were already beginning to desert. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, but the government kept trying to maintain the illusion of order. Brennan had orders to distribute the gold to units that no longer existed, to pay soldiers who had already started walking home. Whitmore, Morrison, and 2 other men had encountered Brennan's small convoy at a river crossing, where they'd been ordered to provide medical assistance to wounded soldiers in the paymaster's escort. What they'd found instead was a dying officer and 3 barely conscious guards, all victims of Mexican raiders who had attacked the convoy the night before. "We could have saved Brennan if we'd started treatment immediately," Morrison said, his voice heavy with old guilt. "But when we saw all that gold just sitting there, when we realized that no one else knew about the convoy or expected it to reach its destination, temptation got the better of our medical oaths. They'd allowed Brennan to die, finished off the wounded guards with overdoses of morphine, and created a scene that suggested a successful raid by Mexican bandits. The gold, nearly $5,000 in double eagles, had been divided among the 4 conspirators, with the understanding that they would wait until after the war to claim their shares. But Whitmore couldn't live with what we'd done," Morrison continued. "The guilt ate at him, made him paranoid and unpredictable. He started talking about using the gold to rebuild the South, about divine providence and moral obligations. We realized he was becoming dangerous, that his conscience might lead him to confess everything. The other conspirators had decided that Whitmore needed to be silenced permanently, but he'd anticipated their betrayal and disappeared with his share of the gold before they could act. His journal, with its carefully constructed story of Union robbery and Confederate heroism, had been a final attempt to justify his actions and misdirect anyone who might discover his cache. "We never found him," Morrison said. "Spent months searching, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. Eventually we gave up and went our separate ways, figured the gold was lost forever. But you stayed here," Colton observed. "Bought property, built a practice. Why?" Morrison's smile was bitter with self-recrimination. "Because I knew he had to be buried somewhere in this area, and I hoped that someday I'd get lucky and find his hiding place. Spent 20 years wandering these hills, looking for signs, asking careful questions. Never imagined that a pig would succeed where I'd failed." The revelation recontextualized everything about Colton's situation. The gold wasn't stolen, Union property that might be reclaimed by federal authorities. It was Confederate money, taken from dead men, morally compromised, but legally unclaimed. The Pinkerton investigation was based on false information, probably fed to them by someone who'd heard Brennan's drunken stories in Mexican cantinas and mistaken them for truth. But even as relief flooded through him, Colton realized that the immediate danger hadn't diminished. Hawkins and the detectives believed they were recovering stolen federal property, and their plans for the evening remained unchanged, regardless of the gold's true origins. "What do you suggest we do?" Colton asked. Morrison reached into his satchel and withdrew a weapon that made Colton's blood run cold. A small derringer with ivory grips and silver inlays, the kind of weapon favored by gamblers and assassins. Despite his medical training and oath to preserve life, the old doctor had clearly prepared for violence. "We defend what's rightfully yours," Morrison said simply. "I've spent 20 years living with the guilt of what we did to get that gold. Maybe tonight I can start making amends by helping you keep it." Outside, the sound of approaching horses confirmed that their time for planning had run out. The final confrontation was beginning, and both men knew that only one side would see the sunrise. But at least now Colton understood what he was truly fighting for, not stolen federal property, but the blood money of dead Confederates and the chance to build something clean from the ashes of old sins. The modified bear trap sat hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves and dirt near the front gate, its steel jaws spring-loaded and waiting for unwary feet. Colton had spent hours adapting the massive device, filing the teeth to create wounds rather than amputation, and adjusting the tension to ensure it would hold without killing. It was one of a dozen defensive preparations scattered around his property, each one designed to turn his familiar homestead into a maze of obstacles for attacking enemies. The transformation had taken 3 days of careful work, guided by instincts Colton hadn't known he possessed. Years of frontier living had taught him to read terrain, to understand how landscape could be used for advantage or defense. Every depression that could hide a rifle barrel, every rise that commanded a field of fire, every approach that could be covered or blocked, all of it had been catalogued and prepared with the methodical thoroughness of a man who knew his life depended on getting the details right. The house itself had become a fortress within his larger defensive perimeter. Windows were barricaded with furniture and sandbags, leaving only narrow firing ports that would protect him while allowing accurate shooting. The roof had been reinforced with additional timber, creating a sniper's nest that overlooked the entire property. Water barrels were positioned to remain accessible even under siege, and food supplies were distributed among multiple hiding places to prevent a single lucky shot from destroying his ability to sustain a prolonged defense. But the most important element of his preparation wasn't tactical, it was psychological. Colton had spent the afternoon writing what might be his final letter to Sarah's memory, pouring out thoughts and regrets that he'd carried silently for 2 years. The act of writing had brought an unexpected peace, a sense of completion that allowed him to face the coming violence without the burden of unfinished emotional business. "My dearest Sarah," he'd written in careful script, "I know you would disapprove of what I'm about to do, but I hope you can understand why I have no choice. This land holds everything we built together, everything we dreamed of becoming. I cannot let corrupt men take it from us, even if defending it requires me to become someone you might not recognize." The letter was sealed and hidden, where it would be found if he didn't survive the night, a final accounting for choices that circumstances had forced upon him. Writing it had been both cathartic and terrifying, an acknowledgement that the peaceful rancher he'd been for 15 years was about to die, regardless of the battle's outcome. Pete Morrison moved through the defensive preparations with the efficiency of a man who'd planned similar positions during the war, checking sightlines and suggesting improvements with the casual expertise of someone who'd survived 4 years of professional violence. Despite his 70-odd years, the old doctor displayed a vitality and alertness that suggested the approaching conflict had awakened parts of his personality that had long lain dormant. "Angle that rifle rest a bit more to the left," Morrison suggested as they prepared the upstairs firing position. "You want to cover the approach from the creek, not just the main road. They'll try to flank us if they have any sense." The transformation in Morrison was as remarkable as the physical changes to the property. Gone was the mild-mannered community physician, replaced by someone who moved with predatory awareness and spoke in the clipped tones of military command. It was as if the prospect of violence had stripped away decades of civilian veneer, revealing the hardened soldier beneath. "Pete," Colton said as they made final adjustments to their positions, "why are you doing this? You could walk away, claim you were never here. No one would blame you for avoiding this fight." Morrison paused in his examination of the Derringer's action, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent living with compromised honor and delayed justice. "Because 20 years ago, I stood by and watched good men die for gold that should have gone to soldiers who needed it," Morrison replied. "Because I took money that was paid for with other men's blood and used it to build a comfortable life while telling myself I'd earned it. Because tonight might be my only chance to do something decent with whatever years I have left." The old doctor's confession revealed depths of guilt and self-recrimination that Colton hadn't suspected. Morrison's comfortable position in the community, his reputation as a healer and helper, all of it had been built on a foundation of stolen gold and murdered men. The approaching battle represented more than just a fight for survival. It was Morrison's attempt at redemption, his chance to balance scales that had been weighted with blood and betrayal for 2 decades. "Besides," Morrison added with a grim smile, "I'm old enough that dying in a good cause might be preferable to dying in bed, surrounded by people who don't know who I really am." Daisy had been moved to the barn for her protection, though she'd made her displeasure known with loud grunting and attempts to follow Colton back to the house. The pig's intelligence was remarkable, and she seemed to understand that danger was approaching with the same instinctive awareness that had guided her excavations. Her presence in the barn would serve dual purposes, keeping her safe while providing an early warning system if attackers tried to approach from that direction. As midnight approached, both men settled into their prepared positions and began the nerve-wracking wait that preceded combat. Colton occupied the upstairs rifle nest, where he commanded views of all the major approaches to the house. Morrison took position in the kitchen, where his Derringer would be most effective in close quarters, while his medical supplies remained easily accessible. The night sounds of the Texas hill country provided an audio landscape that both men monitored carefully for signs of human intrusion. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through oak leaves, the calls of night birds, all of it formed a baseline against which any artificial sounds would stand out clearly. Both men had developed the frontier dweller's ability to read the night, to distinguish between natural and threatening disturbances. "They'll come before dawn," Morrison predicted in a whisper that barely carried across the darkened house. Want enough darkness to hide their approach, but enough light to see what they're shooting at. Colton nodded, though he knew Morrison couldn't see the gesture. His hands were steady on his rifle, despite the adrenaline that coursed through his system, and his breathing remained controlled and even. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he was as ready as preparation and determination could make him. The gold chest sat locked in a trunk beneath his bed, 30 feet below his current position, but already feeling like it belonged to another lifetime. The money that had seemed like salvation just days earlier now felt more like a curse, valuable enough to attract killers, but ultimately worthless if it cost him his life to keep it. But even as that thought crossed his mind, Colton rejected it. The gold represented more than just financial security. It was proof that a man could change his circumstances through courage and determination, that the quiet desperation of recent years didn't have to define the rest of his life. More importantly, it was connected to this land, to Sarah's memory, and to the future he'd promised to build in her honor. The sound that both men had been expecting came just after 2 in the morning, the soft nickering of horses being reined to a halt beyond the property's visible boundaries. The attack was beginning, and everything they'd prepared for was about to be tested in the crucible of actual combat. Colton's finger found the trigger of his rifle as he peered into the darkness, searching for movement among the shadows. Somewhere in that darkness, corrupt lawmen and hired killers were making their final approach, confident that they were about to overwhelm a simple rancher and claim a fortune in stolen gold. They were about to discover that they had seriously underestimated their opposition, and that some fights were worth dying for, regardless of the odds. Sarah's wedding ring pressed against Colton's chest, where he'd tucked it into his shirt pocket, its familiar weight, a comfort that steadied his nerves as the first shadows began moving across his property. The simple gold band had never left his finger since their wedding day 15 years earlier, but tonight he'd removed it with the solemn understanding that he might not survive to wear it again. Having it close to his heart felt like carrying a piece of Sarah's strength into battle. The attack began with professional precision that confirmed these weren't ordinary bandits or opportunistic thieves. 3 figures moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the coordinated advance of men who'd fought together before, their approach routes carefully planned to minimize exposure while maximizing their ability to bring concentrated fire on the house. They'd studied his property during their surveillance, and their tactics reflected that knowledge. Colton's first shot took the leftmost attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling behind a limestone outcropping that provided decent cover. The man's cry of pain and surprise shattered the night's silence, transforming careful stealth into open warfare. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the darkness as the remaining attackers returned fire, their bullets chewing splinters from the wooden window frame, inches from Colton's position. 2 more coming up from the creek, Morrison called from below, his voice calm despite the circumstances. The old doctor had positioned himself to cover the house's rear approaches, and his warning gave Colton precious seconds to adjust his defensive plan. The sound of splintering wood from the kitchen indicated that Morrison had engaged his targets. The sharp crack of his derringer followed immediately by a man's scream and the heavier boom of shotgun fire. Glass shattered somewhere below, and Colton could hear furniture being overturned as the battle moved into the house itself. Dutch Kerner appeared at the edge of Colton's vision, using the barn as cover while he worked his way toward the house's front entrance. The Pinkerton detective moved with the fluid competence of a professional killer, his rifle held ready while his eyes constantly scanned for threats. But his focus on the house's defenses blinded him to the trap that waited near the gate. The modified bear trap's steel jaws snapped shut around Dutch's left ankle with a sound like breaking bones, sending him crashing to the ground with a howl that could be heard across 3 counties. The trap held him fast, while its filed teeth bit deep enough to ensure he wouldn't be walking away from this fight, but not deep enough to cause immediate death. He lay writhing in the dirt, his rifle forgotten as he tried desperately to pry the steel jaws apart with his bare hands. Kane, the senior Pinkerton detective, immediately shifted position to help his fallen partner, but his movement exposed him to Colton's rifle. The rancher's second shot took Kane in the thigh, sending him stumbling toward the limited cover provided by Sarah's old flower garden. Blood stained his pants leg as he dragged himself behind a pile of stones that had once bordered her roses. "Briggs!" Kane shouted, his voice tight with pain and rage. "You're surrounded. Give up the gold and we'll let you live." The offer was almost certainly a lie, but it confirmed what Colton had suspected about their intentions. These weren't lawmen conducting a legitimate investigation, they were thieves with badges, no different from the Confederate deserters who'd killed for the gold 20 years earlier. "Come and take it," Colton called back, working the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. Sarah's ring seemed to pulse against his chest, reminding him of promises made and vows that transcended death. Sheriff Hawkins had taken cover behind the well, using its stone construction to shield himself while he tried to find an angle for effective fire. His silver pocket watch caught a stray beam of moonlight as he checked the time, his movements betraying the nervousness of a man who'd planned other people's violence but rarely participated in it personally. The battle's rhythm settled into the deadly pattern of siege warfare, with both sides trading carefully aimed shots while maneuvering for advantage. Colton's prepared positions gave him superior fields of fire, but the attackers had numbers and the desperation of men who'd committed too many crimes to retreat empty-handed. Morrison's derringer spoke twice more from the kitchen, followed by the sound of a body hitting the floor. But the old doctor's triumph was short-lived. Return fire from outside shattered the remaining kitchen windows, filling the air with glass fragments and wood splinters. Morrison's pained grunt suggested he'd been hit, though not seriously enough to silence his weapon. "Pete," Colton called, "you all right down there?" "Still breathing," Morrison replied, though his voice carried the strain of a man fighting through pain. "But they're pressing hard on the back door. Can't hold them much longer." Daisy's agitated squealing from the barn added to the chaos, the pig's distress calls, providing an audio backdrop to the gunfight that reminded Colton of what had started this entire deadly sequence. Without Daisy's determined digging, the gold would still be buried, and his life would still be sliding toward quiet desperation. Now that digging might cost both of them their lives. Kane struggled to his feet behind the stone pile, blood loss making him unsteady, but his rifle still functional. He'd managed to bind his wounded thigh with strips torn from his shirt, buying himself time before shock and blood loss rendered him combat ineffective. His shot came closer to Colton's position than any previous attempt, the bullet passing close enough to his ear that he could feel its passage. The wounded man caught in the bear trap had stopped his struggles and was now trying to reach his fallen rifle, his movements hampered by pain but driven by the understanding that capture meant death. Dutch had always been the most pragmatic of the three attackers, and he recognized that their carefully planned operation had become a desperate fight for survival. Hawkins made his move while Colton was focused on Kane, sprinting from the well toward the house's front door with the clumsy determination of a man who'd spent too many years behind a desk. His approach was predictable and poorly executed, but it forced Colton to shift his attention at a crucial moment. The sheriff's charge might have succeeded if not for Morrison's foresight in preparing the front entrance. The old doctor had rigged a simple but effective trap using fishing line and a loaded shotgun, turning the door into a lethal surprise for anyone who tried to force entry. Hawkins triggered the device when he hit the door with his shoulder, and the shotgun blast caught him center mass from a distance of 3 feet. The sheriff's body crashed backward off the porch, his silver pocket watch spinning through the air to land in the dirt near Daisy's latest excavation. The timepiece continued ticking for several seconds before its mechanism finally wound down, marking the end of a corruption that had festered in their community for years. But Hawkins' sacrifice had served its purpose. His charge had distracted Colton long enough for Kane to reach a better position. The Pinkerton detective was now close enough to the house that his rifle could punch through the wooden walls, turning Colton's cover into a liability rather than protection. The first phase of the battle was ending with casualties on both sides and no clear victor. But as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, both surviving combatants understood that the next few minutes would determine whether justice or greed would claim the blood money that had waited so long beneath Texas soil. The smoking derringer in Pete Morrison's weathered hand still held one unfired round, its twin barrels crossed in the classical dueling pistol configuration that marked it as a gentleman's weapon from an earlier era. The old doctor emerged from the kitchen with blood streaming from a shallow scalp wound, his medical bag clutched in his free hand, and his eyes holding the cold calculation of a man who'd spent 4 years learning that sometimes healing required killing first. Kane had managed to work his way around to the house's eastern wall, where the rising sun would silhouette any defender who tried to engage him through the windows. His wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, and his professional experience gave him tactical advantages that offset his physical disadvantage. He understood that time was his enemy. Blood loss would eventually claim him if the battle dragged on, but his opponents were running low on ammunition and defensive options. "Morrison!" Kane called from his position against the wall. "I know you're in there, you old bastard." 20 years I've been tracking leads from Brennan's confession, following dead ends and cold trails, but it was worth it to finally put the pieces together. The revelation that Kane had been hunting the gold for 2 decades, not just investigating a recent federal case, changed the entire dynamic of the conflict. This wasn't a professional law enforcement operation, it was personal revenge, dressed up in official badges and legal pretenses. "Brennan told me everything before he died," Kane continued, his voice carrying clearly through the shattered windows. "How you 4 killed that paymaster and his men, how you let them bleed out while you counted stolen money, how Whitmore went crazy with guilt and ran off with his share." Morrison appeared at the kitchen doorway, his derringer held steady despite the blood that obscured half his vision. The old doctor's face was pale with shock and blood loss, but his voice remained strong when he replied to Kane's accusations. "Brennan was a lying drunk who sold out his dead friends for whiskey money," Morrison said. "If you'd spent 20 years chasing his stories, you've wasted 20 years of your life." Kane's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Maybe so, but it led me here, didn't it? Led me to the gold and to the last 2 men who helped steal it. That's got to count for something." The Pinkerton detective fired twice through the kitchen wall, his bullets punching through the wooden planks with enough force to shatter dishes and overturn furniture. Morrison dove for cover behind the cast-iron stove, but not before one of Kane's rounds caught him in the side, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. Colton could hear the old doctor's labored breathing from his position upstairs, could sense that Morrison was badly hurt and running out of strength. The derringer only held 2 rounds, and Morrison had already used 1 to eliminate the attacker who'd tried to breach the back door. If Kane managed to force entry into the house, the old doctor would have only 1 shot to stop him. Dutch had finally given up trying to free himself from the bear trap and was now focused on reaching his rifle, which lay just beyond his fingertips in the growing daylight. The Pinkerton's face was grey with pain and blood loss, but his eyes still held the determined focus of a professional who understood that surrender meant death. He'd managed to fashion a crude tourniquet from his belt, buying himself precious time before shock claimed him. The sound of splintering wood indicated that Kane was forcing his way into the house through the damaged kitchen wall, using his rifle butt to enlarge holes created by his gunfire. Morrison's pained grunt suggested the old doctor was trying to move, probably attempting to reach a better defensive position despite his wounds. Colton made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He abandoned his prepared sniper's position and moved toward the stairs, determined to reach Morrison before Kane could finish him. Sarah's ring bounced against his chest as he moved, a tangible reminder of the promises that bound him to defend this house and the people who'd become his allies. The stairs creaked under his weight, a sound that would alert Kane to his movement but couldn't be avoided. Colton reached the kitchen doorway just as the Pinkerton detective's leg appeared through the hole he'd carved in the wall, followed immediately by his rifle barrel, sweeping the room for targets. Morrison lay crumpled behind the stove, conscious but clearly fading fast. His derringer was still in his hand, but his arm shook with the effort of keeping it raised. Blood pooled beneath him. More blood than a 70-year-old man could afford to lose and still remain effective in a fight. Kane's head and shoulders emerged through the wall opening, his pale eyes immediately locking onto Morrison's position. The detective's rifle began to swing toward the wounded doctor, finger tightening on the trigger for what would be the killing shot. Morrison's derringer fired at the same instant that Kane's rifle found its target, the two weapons speaking almost simultaneously in the confines of the devastated kitchen. Kane's shot went wide as Morrison's bullet took him in the chest, the .41 caliber round punching through his ribs and into vital organs. The Pinkerton detective crashed backward through the hole he'd created, his rifle clattering to the floor as he fell. But Morrison paid the price for his heroic shot. Kane's bullet had missed its intended target, but found the old doctor's chest, where it shattered ribs and punctured a lung. Morrison's breathing became a wet, rattling sound that Colton recognized as the beginning of the end. "Pete," Colton said, kneeling beside his unlikely ally and applying pressure to the worst of his wounds. "Hold on, we can get you help." Morrison's smile was peaceful despite the pain that racked his body. "No help for this, son. But Kane's finished, and Dutch won't last much longer in that trap. You've won." Outside, Dutch had finally managed to reach his rifle, but his movements were sluggish with blood loss and shock. He managed to get off one shot toward the house before his strength failed entirely, the bullet going wild and embedding itself harmlessly in the oak tree that marked Sarah's grave. The silence that followed was broken only by Morrison's labored breathing and the distant sound of Daisy's agitated grunting from the barn. Dawn was breaking fully now, painting the battlefield in golden light that revealed the full cost of the night's violence. 3 men lay dead or dying in the yard, and Morrison wouldn't see another sunset. "The gold," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "Use it right, Colton. Don't let it be blood money anymore." The old doctor's eyes closed for the final time, just as the sun cleared the horizon, his long struggle for redemption ending with a sacrifice that had saved both Colton's life and his chance for a better future. Pete Morrison had finally found a way to balance the scales that had been weighted with guilt and shame for 20 years, though the price had been everything he had left to give. Colton sat in his ruined kitchen, holding the hand of a dead man who'd become a friend in the space of a single night, and understood that the battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. The new property deed lay spread across the kitchen table that Colton had rebuilt with his own hands, its official seals and legal language representing far more than simple land ownership. The document bore the signatures of territorial officials and federal commissioners, legally establishing his claim to an additional 40 acres of prime hill country grazing land. But more importantly, it represented the legitimacy that had been missing from his life since Daisy first uncovered the buried chest 6 months earlier. Marshal Tom Bradley had arrived 3 days after the gunfight, drawn by reports of federal agents operating outside their jurisdiction and finding instead a battlefield littered with the bodies of corrupt lawmen and hired killers. His investigation had been thorough and fair, guided by evidence rather than assumptions, and conducted with the professional integrity that had made his reputation throughout Texas. The gold's true origins, revealed through Morrison's deathbed confession and supported by documents found among Kane's possessions, had simplified what could have been a complex legal proceeding. Confederate payroll money had no federal claimant, and the deaths of the original thieves had legally severed any competing ownership claims. The treasure belonged to the man who'd found it, free and clear of criminal liability. "You're a lucky man, Briggs," Bradley had said as he prepared to leave. Lucky that Morrison lived long enough to tell the truth. Lucky that those Pinkerton men kept such detailed records of their conspiracy. And lucky that you had the backbone to defend what was rightfully yours. But Colton understood that luck had played only a small part in his survival. The real factors had been preparation, determination, and the unexpected alliance with a man seeking redemption for old sins. Pete Morrison's grave lay beside Sarah's beneath the old oak tree, marked by a simple headstone that identified him as a friend who died with honor. The weeks following the marshal's departure had been filled with the practical work of rebuilding and planning. The homestead bore scars from the gunfight that would never fully heal, bullet holes in the walls, bloodstains in the kitchen floorboards, memories of violence that would always shadow the peaceful rhythms of ranch life. But there was also new growth, both literal and metaphorical. Daisy had taken to sleeping on Morrison's grave, as if the pig understood that her archaeological efforts had led to both treasure and tragedy. Her daily routine now included visits to both burial sites, where she would lie quietly for hours in what seemed like genuine mourning. The intelligence that had guided her initial digging now manifested as a deeper awareness of loss and loyalty that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The Sarah Memorial Fund had been Colton's first major expenditure from the gold, a charitable foundation designed to help struggling families throughout the hill country. The fund provided low-interest loans for farmers facing foreclosure, medical assistance for families who couldn't afford proper health care, and educational opportunities for children whose parents lacked the resources to pay for schooling. Henry Kowalski had been the fund's first beneficiary, receiving enough money to drill a proper well and expand his cattle operation. His embarrassed gratitude had been difficult to accept, but it represented the beginning of Colton's transformation from isolated widower to community pillar. The gold that had once represented personal salvation was becoming a tool for lifting up everyone around him. Sarah would be proud, Henry had said as they watched his children play in the yard that Daisy's digging had once threatened to destroy. She always said you had more to give than you knew. The local school had received funds for new books and a qualified teacher, ending years of educational neglect that had left too many children unable to read or write effectively. The church had been expanded and improved, providing a proper meeting place for a community that had previously gathered in whatever building could accommodate a crowd. The doctor who'd replaced Morrison had been provided with modern medical equipment and supplies, ensuring that future emergencies wouldn't end in needless tragedy. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Colton himself. The man who'd once been ready to slaughter his pig rather than face another day of financial pressure had become someone who found purpose in solving other people's problems. The gold had provided the means, but Morrison's example had provided the inspiration for using wealth responsibly rather than selfishly. The expanded ranch operation employed 6 men on a regular basis, providing steady wages for families who'd previously survived on seasonal work and uncertain income. Cattle grazed on land that had once been empty prairie, and the sound of construction rang across the valley as new buildings rose to support the growing enterprise. What had been a struggling homestead was becoming a prosperous ranch that anchored the community's economic development. Evenings found Colton on his rebuilt porch, often in the company of neighbors who'd come to seek advice or simply enjoy conversation with someone who'd proven that circumstances could be changed through courage and determination. Daisy usually joined these gatherings, accepting scratches behind her ears and treats from visitors who'd learned to appreciate her remarkable intelligence. The chest that had started everything sat in the bank vault in Austin, its remaining contents earning steady interest while providing security for Colton's ambitious plans. But a small portion of the original treasure remained in his house, kept in Sarah's jewelry box as a reminder of how dramatically life could change when opportunity met preparation. The wooden cross that Sarah had carved still held its place of honor on the mantelpiece, but it no longer represented unanswered prayers or abandoned faith. Instead, it had become a symbol of values that transcended death, a reminder that moral choices echoed through generations, and that redemption was possible even for those who'd lost their way. As autumn painted the hill country in shades of gold that reminded him daily of the treasure that had transformed his world, Colton often reflected on the strange sequence of events that had brought him to this point. A pig's stubborn digging, an old man's guilty conscience, and a decision to fight rather than surrender had combined to create possibilities he could never have imagined. The land that had once threatened to slip away from him now stretched in all directions, legally his and morally justified by the uses to which he'd put his unexpected wealth. Sarah's dream of a prosperous ranch that served the broader community had been realized through means she never could have anticipated, but in ways that honored the values she'd held most dear. Daisy's latest excavation had revealed nothing more valuable than an old horseshoe and some rusted metal scraps, but Colton no longer worried about her destructive habits. The pig had earned the right to dig wherever she pleased, and if her efforts occasionally produced archaeological surprises, he was prepared to deal with whatever consequences might follow. The future stretched ahead with a security and purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. There would be challenges, drought, disease, economic uncertainty, and all the other hazards that faced anyone who chose to build something lasting on the frontier. But he now possessed both the resources and the confidence to meet those challenges successfully. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Colton could almost hear Sarah's laughter on the evening breeze, approving of the choices he'd made and the life he was building in her memory. The gold that had brought so much violence and corruption into other people's lives had become, in his hands, an instrument of healing and growth that honored the best of what they'd shared together. And in the morning, there would be new work to do, new problems to solve, and new opportunities to prove that even the most unlikely discoveries could be transformed into something worthy of the price that had been paid to obtain them.